Canada didn't flinch, didn't wait, didn't warn. Instead, it shut the steel gates. With Trump's tariffs hitting hard, Ottawa flipped the switch, rerouting steel back home. As furnaces in Hamilton roared to life, American manufacturers were left scrambling, staring at a supply chain nightmare. So now the question hangs, has Canada's retaliation shattered North America's industrial balance? Or is this just a short-term shock? Today, we break down exactly how President Trump's economic nationalism backfired, why Canada is sealing off its steel, and how this single move could choke US factories. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and like the video to stay informed. Canada didn't blink. While Washington waved flags and signed tariffs, Ottawa tightened the screws, quietly. There were no press conferences, no threats. Just a cold, calculated shift. Canadian steel would no longer flow freely across the border. It would stay home. The moment Trump's new tariff package was signed, the response wasn't loud, it was precise. Canadian furnaces roared back to life, but this time, the product wasn't heading to Detroit or Pittsburgh. It was staying in Hamilton, Calgary, and Vancouver. Canada was done playing nice. The nation that once kept its supply chain open in the name of partnership had turned inward. And the US? It never saw it coming. For decades, America leaned on Canada like a trusted sibling in manufacturing. Steel and aluminum flowed across the northern border like water. US companies got it cheap, fast, and without the geopolitical drama of other suppliers. But when Trump's tariffs hit, Canada didn't argue. It pivoted. The government rerouted domestic production to internal buyers, public works, clean energy, infrastructure, and construction. Suddenly, the steel that once built American bridges was reinforcing Canadian hospitals, rail lines, and apartment towers. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a structural shift. The backlash in the US came quick. Auto manufacturers in Michigan and Ohio, already tight on margins, found themselves in a bind. Their supply chains had been optimized for Canadian inputs. When the flow slowed to a trickle, costs exploded. Sheet metal prices jumped 18% in 6 weeks. Some suppliers, unable to meet their delivery obligations, faced penalties from automakers. That triggered layoffs. Then came production halts. Ford and GM were forced to reshuffle operations. Chrysler delayed a major plant upgrade, citing supply uncertainty. Meanwhile, smaller parts manufacturers, those without global procurement teams, had to shut down lines or find lower-quality imports at higher prices. The domino effect spread. In Texas, where oil and gas infrastructure depends heavily on steel tubing and pipe, energy firms saw drilling projects stalled. Welders sat idle. Costs ballooned. Contracts were revised. And in Louisiana, where offshore rigs use massive steel frameworks, delays became the new normal. Projects that were supposed to launch in Q2 were pushed into the next year. Across the Midwest, housing developers sounded the alarm. Steel studs, beams, and rebar were harder to get and pricier by the week. The cost of a new mid-rise building in Chicago rose by 12%, not because of labor or land, but steel. And all of this hit just as the US was trying to reindustrialize. The Biden and Trump camps, despite their rivalry, had both agreed on one thing. America should build more at home. But how do you build when the very material that holds the nation together is now in short supply? The tariffs were meant to boost American steel producers. And to a small extent, they did, at first. Mills in Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Alabama ramped up output. But they quickly ran into a problem: input costs. Many of them still relied on semi-finished Canadian goods. When that stream dried up, they had to either pay more elsewhere or slow production. Some tried to pass the cost onto buyers. But in a fragile economic recovery, that strategy backfired. Orders dropped. Profit margins shrank. And before long, layoffs began. One Indiana-based mill cut 240 workers. Another in Kentucky slashed shifts to part-time. While the big players could weather the turbulence by sourcing globally or leveraging political clout, small and mid-sized mills bore the brunt. And that's when Washington realized this wasn't a trade war, it was a strategic reset. Canada had been planning for this. For years, economists in Ottawa warned about overdependence on the US. Now, they were executing a long-awaited plan. The government offered incentives to construction firms using domestic steel. Infrastructure projects were accelerated with Canada First material sourcing. Provinces like Alberta and Ontario launched grants for green steel production, focusing on hydrogen-powered furnaces and low-emission processes. As the US clashed with its allies, Canada quietly deepened ties with Europe and Asia, expanding its buyer base and reducing exposure to American volatility. By mid-year, the results were showing. Canada's manufacturing sector grew 3.7%, driven largely by steel and aluminum. Exports shifted from volume to value, as finished products replaced raw shipments. Jobs in Hamilton and Regina surged. And for the first time in decades, Canadian industry wasn't dependent on American demand to survive. It was thriving on its own terms. Meanwhile, US lawmakers scrambled. Governors from Rust Belt states demanded exemptions or special aid packages. Pennsylvania's representatives begged for steel relief to save local manufacturers. In Congress, a bipartisan group introduced a bill to roll back some of Trump's tariffs. But the administration, eager to maintain a tough-on-trade image, doubled down. More tariffs were added, this time targeting Canadian finished goods like wire mesh and automotive panels. Canada responded with further internal investment. They didn't fight the fire. They just built a fireproof house. And the political fallout deepened. Blue-collar voters, those promised a revival of American manufacturing, felt betrayed. Their factories weren't booming. They were breaking. Layoffs, delays, and cost hikes weren't headlines. They were real-life consequences. Local news outlets in Ohio and Michigan ran stories of shuttered plants, rising unemployment, and missed paychecks. Editorial boards began questioning whether this version of America First was actually America isolated. Canada and the US were no longer intertwined economies. They were drifting apart. And in that space, global competitors stepped in. South Korean and Brazilian steelmakers began pitching themselves as the next reliable source. US firms, desperate for stability, started listening. For decades, America assumed Canada would always play ball. The assumption was baked into contracts, policies, even diplomacy. That assumption just crumbled. And with it, a generation of supply chain strategies. Back in Washington, policymakers scrambled to contain the fallout. The Trump administration's intent was to reignite American industry through aggressive protectionism. But the gamble underestimated Canada's readiness to pivot and overestimated America's capacity to replace that supply chain overnight. What had once been a seamless North American industrial partnership had cracked, exposing years of complacency. Take Detroit. Once the proud heartbeat of American auto manufacturing, it's now grappling with a steel drought that's cutting deeper than any recession in recent memory. Assembly lines that once hummed around the clock now sit idle for hours, sometimes days. Factory supervisors report shipment delays so severe that schedules are being rewritten weekly. And it's not just the big three automakers. Dozens of smaller, family-owned suppliers, many of whom operate on razor-thin margins, are filing for bankruptcy protection. The local economy, which was only just beginning to stabilize after decades of decline, is teetering once again. Meanwhile, in Canada, a different picture is emerging. The same steel that once fed Detroit's car plants is now building Canada's future. New hospitals, light rail lines, housing projects, and green infrastructure are all being built with Canadian materials. It's not a spike in nationalism, it's strategy. Ottawa didn't just redirect supply, they redirected vision. Canadian steel producers, backed by federal and provincial incentives, are upgrading facilities, hiring workers, and investing in next-generation technology. Hamilton, once seen as a struggling mill town, is now on pace to become the green steel capital of North America. And here's where the US finds itself boxed in. With Canada pulling back, Washington turned to other suppliers, Turkey, Vietnam, and even India. But those imports aren't as reliable or as cheap, especially with added shipping and geopolitical tensions. Worse, Many of these steel sources don't meet the quality or environmental standards required for sensitive infrastructure projects. That leaves America with a hard choice: pay more, delay projects, or compromise on quality. None of those are politically safe options. What started as a tariff meant to defend American jobs is now being blamed for losing them. The tariff war hit both metals, but aluminum's effects are more stealthy and widespread. Think packaging, aerospace, and electronics. Prices are up, availability is down. Startups reliant on affordable materials are either moving production overseas or shutting down entirely. Elon Musk, never one to stay silent, publicly criticized the administration's trade moves, warning they'll cripple innovation in the name of economic theater. His comments were echoed by other tech CEOs and even some Republican governors. Back in Congress, the pressure is mounting. Red state manufacturers are pushing back against the very party that promised them prosperity. Senate committee hearings have turned into blame games. Charts showing job losses and factory closures are being held up beside campaign promises that now seem hollow. And in swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the political calculus is changing fast. Voters who cheered tariffs 2 years ago are now facing pink slips and skyrocketing costs. But Canada? They're not gloating. In fact, they're doubling down on their new path. The federal government just announced a multi-billion-dollar domestic materials fund to ensure long-term independence from foreign reliance. New trade deals are being inked with Germany, Japan, and South Korea, giving Canadian firms global access while the US struggles to retain its old alliances. The European Union has already signaled interest in importing Canada's green steel as part of its decarbonization goals. Meanwhile, US steel producers are locked in domestic pricing battles, unable to compete internationally due to unstable policies and tariffs that isolate rather than empower. Strategists are calling this moment a supply chain reckoning. America's belief that it could isolate itself while staying competitive is cracking. For decades, US dominance in industry relied not just on internal strength but on stable, friendly relationships with immediate neighbors. In the coming days, we'll see if Canada's bold move to shut the steel tap will lead to long-term independence, or if mounting economic strain will push Washington to reverse course. Do you believe Canada's strategy will pay off, or will US pressure force them to reopen trade? We'd love to hear your take on this unfolding story. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay informed with more updates like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.